What's going on, everybody? It's Sailboat, and I'm here with an episode of something that you guys haven't seen in a little while, which is Sailboat's restorations. I actually haven't been doing a lot of restoration projects recently because I've had so much inventory that I've been trying to sort through and trying to get caught up on a lot of backed up work. I'm finally at a point where I feel like I can start doing a little bit of restoration, and I'm about to get started on this pair of Fire Red 4s from 2012. This pair is actually from the homie Jimmy over at JRV Kicks. He's another one of the Soul Supremacy Beater Box members, and we have bended together a handful of times now. He's just an awesome dude, and he gave these shoes to me like a while back, asking if I could do a repaint on them, and I haven't been able to get around to them. Jimmy, if you're watching this, I'm so sorry, bro. They've taken me forever. So let's take a quick look at these shoes so you guys can see the condition of them prior to me repainting them. Overall, they're in halfway decent condition, but they definitely need a little bit of work. So taking a closer look here, we'll start off with the right shoe first. So you can tell that the paint actually isn't all that bad. It's a little bit cracked here up on the front part, and if I press in there, you can see that it cracks pretty damn good. So that'll definitely all need to be stripped and repainted. And then it's pretty similar as we come to the back with the black there. That black is definitely cracking when it's being pressured, but otherwise it looks halfway decent, especially from a distance. Now getting to the white paint you can definitely see some of it is chipping off right there. And as we come over to the medial side of the shoe, it actually looks a lot worse over there. This is all worn off paint. Not 100% sure which shoe it was on, but I know that he said that they had like a little tiny bit of work done to them. Over on the left shoe, similar issues as we start to look at the black paint. You know, it's just that pressure gets applied and it starts to crack up. This spot definitely looks like it had just been painted over. It's pretty rough and it doesn't look even at all. As we come onto the heel, paint's definitely, it looks like it was almost touched up along that heel portion too. Can't say with any certainty. And then as I come over onto the medial side of the shoe, again, it's just like with the pressure, but up and through here, it's not looking so hot. At any rate, I'm gonna start to strip these shoes of all the paint, then we'll prep it all up and we will get the airbrush ready to go. So of course, the very first step in any sort of repaint is to strip all of the old paint off of the shoes. Now, I forget exactly who it was, but I remember a restoration artist on Instagram had recommended using clay tools in order to help to strip the paint. And I gotta say, this saved me a ton of time and also saved the integrity of the shoes. Only afterwards did I use any sort of chemical solvent with some cotton balls to get off only what remained of the paint. After getting off all of the paint, of course, the next thing that you got to do is prep the shoe by taping off all of the areas that you do not want to get any paint on. If you're painting by hand, this obviously isn't quite as big of a deal, but since I was going to be utilizing my airbrush, I wanted to make sure that every other surface was sufficiently covered and taped off well. After prepping the shoes, you gotta prep your airbrush. This is something I'm not gonna go into. If you've used an airbrush before, you know what to do. If not, I recommend looking up videos. And step 4, we start to apply a base layer. Now for my base layer, I started off utilizing white on both the white and black portion of the shoe. But once I began to get to the point where I had sufficient base layers laid down, I actually went ahead and added a little bit of black into the paint to make it more gray. I then taped off the bottom white portion and began utilizing my gray paint to add additional base layers on where the black paint was going to go. After adding several layers of gray paint that got successively darker by adding more black paint, what I ended up doing was removing all of the paint from my airbrush and adding only black paint for when I wanted to do my finishing couple of layers. Once I was done painting with my airbrush, I tried to fill in all of the pores in the more difficult spots by hand brushing the remaining paint in the airbrush onto the shoe.
After finishing up with all of the black paint, I was going to transition over to white paint, so I needed to clean the airbrush and all of the components so that way I could add in the white paint. Throughout the next portion of this process, all that I realistically did was repeat the previous 3 steps, except for this time utilizing white paint. It was a pretty simple process, it's just you have to be very delicate with it, because the more precise you are with your prep work, the better the paint job turns out. Quite honestly, painting the shoe takes the least amount of time. It's actually the prep work that takes the most amount of time. You can see here that I'm again utilizing a hand brush to fill in any tricky pores and tricky spots that I was not able to get to with my airbrush efficiently. So here, I wanted to slow things down for you just a little bit, because who doesn't enjoy a good tape removal? Now you can see that my lines are actually looking super crisp. They came out really nicely, and I'm actually really proud of the prep work that I put in order to make sure that I did not overspray while I was utilizing my airbrush. What you may start to realize though, is that especially on the black portion, you can see a lot of pretty deep pores, and you can see that it doesn't look smooth like that factory finish. I decided to take the tape off of the other shoe too, because I wanted to see how that one came out, and sure enough, it kind of looked the same. Once I had removed the tape, it was time to go and add a little bit of touch-up work by hand brushing any of the uneven spots and trying to add a little bit of paint into the pits in the pores to try and smooth out the midsole surface. After I applied additional hand paint, I went through and I added some finisher. Now I'm going to be completely honest with you, the amount of finisher that I used during this step was completely excessive. I definitely don't recommend using nearly as much as what I'm utilizing in these shots right here. You can actually get away with a quick little spray, and that should be sufficient. Make sure that you don't add too much finisher, otherwise it may actually discolor the repaint that you just did, and that's obviously not something that you want. Additionally, too much finisher can make the paint harden up quite a bit, which can make it more susceptible to cracking. After adding my finisher, I removed the remainder of the tape. Now, as I'm removing the tape here, you're going to see that some of the spots on this midsole still look kind of pitted out, and they still look kind of porous. Now, this is totally on me. I definitely should have gone through and kind of sanded down those surfaces and tried to add a little bit of a finisher or some sort of scratch-resistant sealer to kind of seal up the pits in the pores. But unfortunately, I didn't think about doing this prior to painting, and I only started to see how deep the pits in the pores were after I was done painting. You can see here that sometimes the tape will get a little bit stuck between the upper and the midsole. It's always nice to have a little pick tool on you, so then that way you can utilize it to help to get out all of the excess tape. When you have extra tape there, it can just kind of take away from the overall cleanliness of the job, so you definitely want to try to remove as much as possible.
So here we are. It's nearly the end of this repaint of these fire red fours from 2012. Quite honestly, they've come out pretty damn good. I've only had a little bit of experience when it comes to repainting shoes, and so far, it's been very mixed for me. This is the first project that I feel really confident with after being done with it, and even though there's a lot of stuff that I can improve on, I'm definitely really happy with the result. Obviously, as I was stripping all of the original paint, I began using my clay tools. This was one of the best things that I have ever done when it comes to removing paint from any sort of Jordan's book.
before because it allowed me to strip the paint so much more easily. After stripping as much of the paint as I could with the clay tools, I did hit it with a little bit of strip from 15-7 Restorations. Really great product. I have had a lot of luck with it, especially when it comes to stripping glue from shoes, but it still is a bit of a damaging material, so you do have to be careful with your application, and you'll be able to see some of the pitting that did occur from a little bit of overuse of this product. Overall, with the exception of a couple of spots that I'm gonna have to go and touch up, these came out really nicely. After posting pictures of what I thought was going to be my final product to Instagram, I got a lot of criticism about the pores and the pitting in the midsoles. This was something I hadn't really considered prior to starting my repaint, and I hadn't really noticed until my repaint was nearly finished. What I decided to do was go through and sand out all of the pits and the pores using some really fine grit sandpaper. After brushing away all of the finisher and the paint, I filled in the pores using Raleigh Restoration's scratch resistant sealer. I added some pretty thick applications, and then after letting it dry, I would go through and again take my sandpaper and try to sand down all of those areas that I had just painted over with the scratch resistant sealer. After doing this several times, the midsoles had noticeably smoothed out, and then I decided to go through and hand paint all of the spots that I had just sanded down so that I could get a little bit of a more even set of paint throughout the midsole. After finishing up with my hand painting, it was time to prep the shoes again. This meant that I had to go through and retape nearly everything on the shoe because I knew that I was going to have to airbrush everything to give it that nice, even coat of paint. After a few extra layers, things looked pretty good, and it was time to go through and remove my tape again. Now this time, you can tell that the midsoles are actually looking a lot smoother. They're a lot closer to that traditional factory finish, and I'm not gonna lie, I think that they look a lot better. So even though it took a lot of extra time and I had to redo all of my prep work, I think that the results were actually much better, to be honest with you. And I'm really happy with the way that these things came out at the end of the day. So obviously, I went through and kind of redid the midsoles to a certain extent. It wasn't a complete redo. I just sanded down some of the more porous spots, filled it in with a little bit of sealer, filled it in with a little bit of paint, and then finished it off using a couple of extra coats of paint from my airbrush. Let's take a closer look at the finished product, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the steps that I took to get the midsoles looking a little bit. So we'll start by taking a look at the right shoe, and I'm gonna be honest with you, the whole reason that I went through and redid this was because I got a lot of people telling me that I should fill in the pores on Instagram. Some of them had some constructive criticism, some just some straight up criticism, but at any rate, I went through and I touched it up because, you know, I feel like if they were gonna say something, I didn't want to be sending these out to the homie who was gonna see them and try to sell them and have him say something too. So I wanted to do my best job for him. So you can tell that the front portion here of the midsole, it looks better. It looks a lot more smoothed out. The bottom part was really cracked up before, and now it's actually pretty good looking. Hey, it turned out pretty nicely. As we come more towards the back side here, you can see that this lateral side of the shoe actually looks really good. Like, that's pretty solid. It's definitely got a lot of integrity. It's not cracking like some of the previous paint jobs that I've had, so I'm very happy about that. This is one of the pores that I was unable to fill all the way. Unfortunately, it just ended up being a little bit too deep, and I didn't want to use too much filler in there. As we make our way around to the heel, a little bit harder to see with the lighting. Heel looks pretty good, and then coming over onto the medial side of the shoe, you can see right in the middle here, this was a spot I definitely should have sanded down a little bit more. Unfortunately, I didn't do a great job with that, but I don't think it's going to affect the shoe too badly. I mean, it still looks good, and it's not like too porous or anything. Coming over to the left shoe here, again, this front section is looking a lot better. It's definitely not 100%. There's a few spots that I probably could have filled in a little bit better, but compared to where it was, it looks a ton better. As we come over onto the lateral aspect of the shoe right here, you can see that this is actually looking pretty solid as well, but there is a little bit where I could have sanded down probably a little bit better. Coming onto the heel, again, that was where some of the worst pores were, so I wasn't able to fill them in 100% of the way, but they look a lot better than where we started. Same thing with the heel on the medial side of the shoe. It was a lot deeper than I was expecting it to be, and it was hard to fill in all the way. And then as we come over to the medial side of the shoe, we're looking pretty damn smooth. Again, maybe like a couple of spots that I could have sanded down ever so slightly, but overall it looks a lot better than where we started.
So obviously these shoes are looking a little bit better than they were after I first finished the repaint, or thought that I had finished the repaint. They're not 100% perfect, but I think that with a little bit more prep work and actually filling in the pores prior to painting next time will give me a leg up, and I probably will be able to cut off a significant chunk of time in my actual process of getting these all painted. But it was definitely a really good learning experience. This is by far the best repaint that I've ever had. I'm continuing to learn, so I'm really excited that this one came out pretty well. At any rate, that's the end of this restoration. Realistically, this process took me probably 5, 6, maybe even closer to 7 or 8 hours. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I had to do my prep work twice, and I also kind of forgot some steps along the way and had to go back and touch things up a little bit. Gonna send these out to my homie Jimmy now so he can see them for himself and hopefully get them on the market to sell them real quick. Thank you very much, Jimmy, for allowing me to practice on this pair. I really do appreciate it, man. You guys make sure to check him out. He is on Instagram at JRVKicks. And Jimmy's an absolutely awesome dude. I've vended with him multiple times at multiple shows, and every single time we have a really good time. Shout out to you, Jimmy, and again, thank you. Thank you guys who stuck around to watch this video until the cold, bitter end. As always, I'm Sailboat, and I'm out of here.